Tonight at 10, the United Nations says it's preparing to resume aid deliveries in Syria despite the recent attacks. They were suspended on Monday after an attack on an aid convoy near Aleppo in which 20 people died. At the United Nations today, America questioned the Russians' denial of responsibility and their attitude to restoring the ceasefire.
This is a moment of truth. It's a moment of truth for President Putin and Russia. It's a moment of truth also for the opposition.
We'll have the latest from the United Nations as the security situation in Syria seems to get worse. Also tonight, the death of a teenage boy in a psychiatric hospital in South London is blamed on neglect and failures by staff. Jeremy Corbyn tells us he'll offer an olive branch to his critics if he retains the Labour leadership this weekend. In Iraq, we meet some of the British fighters who've joined the campaign to expel so-called Islamic State.
For people to say that this isn't the West's war, you got your head stuck in the sand.
And to save the African elephant, a call for much tougher rules on the sale of ivory.
Here, calls to tighten checks at the South's ports. We hear from an Afghan boy who spent 32 hours in the back of a lorry. And the 74-year-old making waves, sailing solo non-stop around the world.
Good evening. The United Nations says it's now preparing to resume aid deliveries in Syria. They were suspended after an attack on a convoy near Aleppo on Monday, in which 20 people died. Earlier today, the US Secretary of State John Kerry warned his Russian counterpart that the world faced a moment of truth in Syria. He was addressing the UN in New York following yet another deadly attack on humanitarian workers, as our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins reports.
Monday night's attack on the aid convoy was a shocking part of the violent end to the Syrian ceasefire. American-led accusations that a Russian airstrike was responsible for this and Russian denials of any involvement now threaten to derail the entire search for a Syria peace. At the United Nations, its most powerful body, the Security Council, met to see if any sort of peace process can be saved. Passions were running extraordinarily high, but Russia's foreign minister said nobody should jump to conclusions.
Many said that it could have been a rocket or an artillery shelling. That was what the initial reports were. Then a helicopter or warplanes were mentioned. So I think we need to refrain from emotional reactions and from making public comments immediately, and first investigate and be very professional.
That appeal to avoid feelings was too much for America's Secretary of State. John Kerry let rip in a sustained assault on Russia's motives and credibility backing President Assad.
How can people go sit at a table with a regime that bombs hospitals and drops chlorine gas again and again and again and again and again and again and acts with impunity? You're supposed to sit there and have happy talk in Geneva?
And then he dismissed Moscow's accounts of the attack on the aid convoy, including one suggestion it might have been a simple fire on the ground.
The trucks and the food and the medicine just spontaneously combusted. Anybody here believe that? I mean, this is not a joke.
So what do we know about the attack on the aid convoy? It took place on Monday night. The convoy was in the town of Urem al-Kubra, intending to head on to rebel-held areas in Aleppo province. Russia has admitted tracking the convoy with a drone. They say their footage shows it was accompanied by an armed rebel vehicle. Later that evening, the convoy was hit. Those at the scene insist it was struck from the air.
Helicopters dropped 4 barrel bombs, then Russian jets bombed us. There were more than 20 bombs and lots of strafing.
The United States say there were Russian strike planes in the sky above the convoy at the precise moment it was hit. But Russia strongly denies involvement. It says there are no craters at the scene and suggests that somehow the cargo caught fire. But the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, doesn't buy that, convinced the attack was from the air and that only the Russians had the capability.
There are only 2 possible culprits, only two forces that are capable of having carried out that strike, flying in that area. They are the Syrians and the Russians, and we have our doubts about the Syrian capability to fly at night. And so you're left with a pretty strong conclusion, as you'll have been hearing.
The UN is preparing to resume aid convoys in Syria, but not to Aleppo, under heavy bombardment again today. 4 medical staff were killed by strikes south of the city, leaving the head of their relief organisation distraught.
Hospitals in Syria are the riskiest place, I swear. Hospitals are more dangerous than the front line.
This has been an extraordinary day of reckoning at the UN. The unprecedented level of public anger from John Kerry suggests he sees little future trying to broker a peace by working with Russia. Trouble is, without Russia there can be no peace. It's by far the strongest military power inside Syria. So somehow the diplomatic effort must limp on. James Robbins, BBC News at the United Nations.
Well, let's go live to the UN tonight in New York, and Lise Doucette is there, our chief international correspondent. Let's have your assessment, Lise, of the likelihood of reimposing this ceasefire which was started last week.
Well, John Kerry put it right. He said it was a moment of truth, and the truth of the matter is there is very little hope that this tangled conflict that is Syria can actually move towards any kind of positive resolution, even a truce on the ground that is proving so difficult. Listen to the anger in John Kerry's voice, the consummate diplomat who has been surrounded by doubters in his own State Department, in the US military, who said you're on a fool's errand trying to make a deal with Russia. He's been humiliated by the Russians, he believes. It's no joke, he said in the UN Security Council today, and yet the mediators like to say there were 500 days of failure and 1 day of success. Staffan de Mistura, the UN envoy, told me he still believes that John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov will go back to the table because they know that the thread that John Kerry talked about, that this Syria was hanging by a thread, they control that thread. If they don't go back to the table, then there really is nothing. But diplomats here have told me it is stuck. It is really stuck, and they don't know how it's going to move forward. The one bright light is Staffan de Mistura told us that they are going to start delivering aid. Syria needs aid, but most of all, Syria needs peace. And at the UN Security Council today, there's a real sense that Syria is moving back, and a big question mark, will it ever move forward?
Lise, again, thanks very much. Lise Doucette there for us at the United Nations. A coroner has ruled that neglect by one of England's biggest mental health trusts contributed to the death of Christopher Brennan, a 15-year-old patient in South London. The inquest was told that staff carried out no risk assessment, even though he had a history of self-harm. Campaigners say the case illustrates wider failings in the care of children in psychiatric hospitals. Our social affairs correspondent, Michael Buchanan, has been speaking to Christopher's family.
What are your strongest memories of him?
His smile. Everyone commented on his smile.
He'd do like little things, I don't know, come into my room and try to get me to sniff his feet or something.
Christopher Brennan was a happy-go-lucky little boy who became a very sick teenager. He started hearing voices in his head that drove him to self-harm.
First we knew was a knock on the door by the police. Christopher was experiencing voices and he didn't feel that he could leave his room, so he phoned up Childline, who sent the police around.
In July 2014, Christopher became seriously ill and was admitted once more to this South London hospital. 6 weeks later, he was dead, having choked on an item he'd swallowed. Today, a coroner concluded gross failings by South London and Maudsley NHS Trust contributed to the 15-year-old's death. The adolescent unit was struggling to cope due to staff shortages. Staff were desensitised to incidents of self-harm due to the sheer number of them, and no risk assessment was carried out of Christopher's behaviour, and there was no up-to-date care plan. The coroner said today she did not believe that Chris intended to die on that day.
No, I don't think he did. No. He had all his plans written out for the future. He wanted to be paramedic, have at least 30 years as a paramedic. He had so much he wanted to do.
Ministers say they're investigating how many other teenagers have died in psychiatric units in England and will publish the details next month. One charity says it's aware of 11 such deaths over a 4-year period and is calling for a wide-ranging inquiry.
There's growing disquiet about the lack of resourcing of mental health services for children and young people. So we want an independent review into the deaths of children and young people so that we can properly act on the vital learning to safeguard lives in the future.
The Trust have apologised to Christopher's family. They say lessons have been learned and that the services were recently independently inspected and found to be of a good standard. The Brennan family certainly hope so others are spared from similar grief.
The house is too quiet without him, isn't it? Even the dog misses him. He used to sit looking for him out of the window for months after.
Michael Buchanan, BBC News, South London.
Well, voting has ended in the Labour leadership contest. The result will be announced at the party conference in Liverpool on Saturday. Jeremy Corbyn, who's being challenged by Owen Smith, told the BBC today that the party should make every effort to unite after the contest, and he offered to wipe the slate clean with those dozens of Labour MPs who have expressed a lack of confidence in his leadership. Mr Corbyn's been speaking to our political editor, Laura Kunsberg.
He's on the edge of winning the Labour leadership for the second time round.
I've got a bigger olive tree at home.
Jeremy Corbyn has an olive tree on his balcony. A few branches might come in handy after months of division and distress.
It's almost like Labour has a split personality between its MPs and the growing membership.
I invite all my colleagues in Parliament to recognise there's an awful lot we agree on. And I tell you, I've had an awful lot of calls from Labour MPs in the last few days who are very interested in how we come together after the 24th.
Throughout most of the last year, the issues haven't necessarily been about disagreement over policy. They've often been about your ability to lead the party. So what will be different about Jeremy Corbyn Mark II?
Sadly for everyone, it's the same Jeremy Corbyn, who's been through the last year, indeed been through the last 30 years in Parliament.
When you have 172 out of 230 of your MPs who are representing 9 million Labour voters saying they had questions about your competence, don't you think you do have to change some things about how you operate?
Despite a lot of very unpleasant remarks that have been made about me by a very large number of Labour MPs, I've not replied to any of them. Wipe the slate clean and move forward.
He won't yet agree to MPs' demands to choose the shadow cabinet, nor change how the leader is picked.
Well, under the old system, an MP would be worth several thousand party members' votes. I don't think that's a very good way of doing things.
He is on their side, and they're on his. Jeremy Corbyn's incredible network of supporters, convinced he's the future, convinced he will and should win.
We are winning. If you can think of one or maybe two words that you believe should be the priority for the next Labour leader. Turn over your cards.
Social justice.
Intersectional feminism.
NHS and affordable housing.
My question to other people is why should he not be given a chance, just like all the other politicians have been given? We feel differently about him and we feel he can do something.
Well, I believe that he's just a principled and authentic person. His unequivocal political stance, it kind of encourages. I find it encouraging because you don't really find that in many politicians these days.
There's a serious divide within our party, and we can't get back to business without reconciliation.
What's more important to you as the party leader? Keeping the membership happy, growing the membership, or winning power?
All three things go together. The membership needs to be content with the general direction the party's going, needs to be active and on board and included and feel included and have their voice included in policy making. That in turn translates into this campaigning activity.
Some people might say you shouldn't mistake that enthusiasm for something that would translate into general election success. 20,000 people used to turn up to hear Michael Foot speak and he never got anywhere near power.
Michael Foot did a great job and did his best. We are going to do even better.
Which is more of a priority to you? Keeping the members happy or winning power? Because leaders often have to make that choice.
You take the members with you in order to win the whole country. The members the party, the leader and the electorate have all got to go in the same direction.
Jeremy Corbyn will almost certainly keep this office at the weekend.
Okay, kids, all right.
But waving at crowds is only part of the job. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Britain is boosting the amount of humanitarian aid it gives to Yemen. The International Development Secretary, Priti Patel, has told the BBC that the government will spend an extra £37 million this year to help the millions of people suffering as a result of civil war. A Saudi-led coalition, which is backed by Britain and the US, has carried out a bombing campaign against the rebels who overthrew the government there some 18 months ago. A naval and aerial blockade by the Saudi coalition, which controls all the goods and the aid coming into the country, has led to further shortages of food and fuel and medicine. In the second of her special reports from Yemen, my colleague at BBC Arabic, Nawal Al-Maghafi, assesses the impact of this conflict.
Yemen has always been struggling, but an 18-month war has crippled this country. Months of fighting have destroyed lives, leaving millions injured, homeless and starving. A 4-month ceasefire gave people hope, but the moment we arrive, it collapses. This factory made potato crisps. 10 people were killed and 300 left jobless. The Saudis claim it was an arms depot, but the owner tells me there were absolutely no weapons or militants.
This isn't the first factory to be targeted in Yemen. It's actually one of many. In fact, 4 factories in this compound alone have been hit, and many others that this family owns across the country have also been completely demolished.
Once Yemen's busiest port, now left at a standstill. A blockade imposed by the Saudi coalition to stop arms from reaching the rebels has caused severe delays in food and aid coming in. All the cranes have been destroyed by airstrikes, making it impossible to offload what does come through.
In a country that relies on imports for 90% of its staple foods, the bombings and the blockade imposed by the Saudis has had a catastrophic effect on the humanitarian situation.
Millions have been forced from their homes, living in makeshift camps like this one. We are suffering, he yells. Tell the world we're suffering. Half of Yemen's population is food insecure, which simply means they don't know where their next meal will come from. The people here tell me they feel forgotten.
These brutal Saudis, they attack innocent civilians. They attack schools, markets, homes. Even people asleep at night, safe in their own homes, they come and bomb them.
The Saudi government has denied deliberately targeting civilians and humanitarian supplies. Both sides in this conflict are accused of atrocities. And as with most wars, it's the people who pay the heaviest price. Nawal Al-Maghafi, BBC News, Yemen.
And by the way, you can see more on the plight of Yemen's children on Our World, which is at 9:30 p.m. this Saturday and Sunday on the BBC News channel, or of course you can catch it on the BBC iPlayer. Now, more than 40 people have died and hundreds are believed to be missing after a boat carrying migrants capsized off the coast of Egypt. More than 160 people have been rescued and search teams are looking for more survivors. It is feared that up to 600 people may have been on board when the vessel overturned in the Mediterranean, some 40 miles west of the city of Alexandria. Now, Britain's vote to leave the European Union has had little immediate impact on the UK economy, according to the Office for National Statistics, but it's warned that the long-term effects remain to be seen. Its latest report came as another body, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, raised its short-term forecast for economic growth in the UK. Our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, has joined me in the studio. Kamal, a list of good news.
Certainly, Hugh, all those who were predicting a real and significant downturn in the UK economy following the referendum if we voted to leave the European Union, have had to revise their forecasts. As you say, Joe Grice, the chief economist at the Office for National Statistics, has said that the UK economy has not, as he described it, fallen at the first hurdle. House prices have not collapsed, employment is still strong, consumer confidence has bounced back. And as you say, the OECD, the big economic forecaster for the global economy, has uprated its growth forecast for this year for Britain, although it does warn about next year, when maybe some of the ramifications of the referendum start to crystallise. We actually spark Article 50. We start the process of leaving the European Union. Such is their worry about next year. They actually suggest that Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, should increase spending to boost the economy. We won't know about that until the autumn statement in November. Tonight, the Federal Reserve, the American central bank, has said it's likely it will increase interest rates this year as the American economy strengthens. That's good for exports, that's good for Britain, good for the global economy. I think what we're seeing here, Hugh, is two big forces in conflict. Consumer confidence on the one side, strong. The Bank of England cut interest rates after the referendum. Money is cheap. The public is feeling good about the economy. On the other side, business caution. That's where the real issues are for the economy. It's how these two trends battle out over the next months, over the next years, that will really show which way the UK economy is going. It's going well, or is there real problems because of Britain leaving the European Union?
OK, Kamal, once again, thanks very much. Kamal Ahmed there for us. Now, the government wants to introduce much tougher rules on the sale of ivory to combat the slaughter of elephants in Africa. There's already a ban on trading in ivory that's less than 70 years old, but at the moment dealers can still get permits to sell in certain circumstances. Campaigners say there should be a total ban on all ivory sales, as there is now in America. Our science editor David Shukman has more details.
A massive bonfire in Kenya earlier this year. The tusks from 6,000 elephants slaughtered by poachers. The killings are triggered by a demand for ivory that just seems unstoppable. So across the Great Plains of Africa, entire herds of elephants are vulnerable. Some populations face a real threat of extinction. So there's huge pressure to clamp down on sales of ivory. And today Britain announced that it would do just that.
We are taking a very significant step forward, banning all modern ivory trading in the United Kingdom. That's a very important step. There is more to do to meet our manifesto commitment, but it does require global concerted action, and so this is a really important first step.
The new measures will still allow antique ivory to be traded, works of art with proven heritage. Only more modern ivory will be banned. Other countries like America have imposed even tougher controls, so antique dealers here are relieved.
It's extremely important that all of us in this country and around the world are able to learn and appreciate and enjoy works of art that are part of our shared cultural inheritance. And somehow if you demonize ivory, that particular aspect of our past gets pushed into a cupboard, so to speak.
The key with ivory is its age and whether it dates from before or after 1947. So this piece is at least 200 years old, and as a work of art it can be traded legally. This one, much paler by comparison, dates from the 1970s, so it can't be legally bought or sold. And what matters is telling these apart. The most reliable system is carbon dating. This lab at Oxford University looks for traces of radioactivity. If there aren't any, the ivory is from before the age of nuclear weapons. But the technique is expensive, and conservationists worry that clamp down on trading doesn't go far enough.
We welcome the fact that the government has made an announcement and is therefore showing a real interest in this issue. But our fear is that they are not going to go far enough to really eradicate the ivory trade in this country.
The test is whether this stops the slaughter of the elephants. The key is halting demand for ivory, especially in China. And every initiative is meant to send a signal to the poachers. David Shukman, BBC News.
7 men have been charged by police investigating allegations of abuse at a young offender centre in Kent, run by the private security firm G4S. It followed undercover filming by the BBC at the Medway Secure Training Centre in Rochester. 6 men have been charged with misconduct in a public office The seventh is accused of taking photographs and making recordings inside a prison, which is contrary to the Prison Act. Now, the forces of so-called Islamic State could be expelled from Iraq within months, according to the Defence Secretary, Michael Fallon. He was speaking during a visit to Iraq, where troops are preparing to attack the northern city of Mosul, which has been occupied by IS forces since 2014. As Iraq's army advances from the south, Kurdish Peshmerga forces are moving in from the east. Our Middle East correspondent, Orla Guerin, has visited their front line just a few miles from Mosul, and she sent this report.
On the front line, a tense moment for Kurdish Peshmerga fighters. The enemy is on the move. They spot a car in territory controlled by the so-called Islamic State. They think it could be carrying explosives.
That's it.
But the moving target gets away. The commander tells me that IS are just a kilometre ahead. They've tried to attack us 30 or 40 times, says General Nabi Dolameri. We have defeated them here, he says, and we will defeat them in Mosul, God willing. We drive over rough terrain along the front line, which stretches for 1,000 kilometres. Riding shotgun in the shadows, a fighter who has been here on Bashik Mountain for 18 months. But his uniform separates him from the rest. He's a former British soldier turned volunteer sniper who says he has no hesitation pulling the trigger on IS.
They're nothing. They're it's like putting your foot on a. It's like putting your foot on an ant. It's nothing.
For you personally, what was it that drew you here to risk your own life? You came from Scotland. This isn't your country, many would say. This isn't your war.
This is, for people to say that this isn't the West's war, you got your head stuck in the sand. If Daesh got their caliphate here, then the next step for them would be Europe. Nice, Paris would be nothing to what we would see. The fact of the matter is that the Peshmerga held the line and has started pushing them back.
But they aren't beaten yet. This mortar landed soon after we arrived. IS were responding to our presence, the Kurds said. Their horizon stretches beyond defeating the insurgents. The Peshmerga have been expanding their territory and plan to keep their gains. They want independence for their autonomous region. But for now, the focus is on freeing Mosul. This IS defector, who surrendered to the Kurds, claims the extremists have dug in for a long fight. We're not revealing his identity because he has relatives living under IS control.
There are many IS fighters in Mosul. They have cars with explosives. They are trying to convert a cannon to fire mustard gas so that when the army comes, they will use it against them. They have full control of the city. They have underground tunnels around Mosul 6 meters below the ground. They have bunkers equipped with bathrooms and enough food to last 5 years.
Back at the front line, a distant glimpse of Mosul, the captive city where IS proclaimed its caliphate. The UN is warning that if the militants decide to make a last stand there, they may want Mosul to die with them. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Northern Iraq.
More than 1.5 million people in the UK work in the digital economy in companies developing computer software or publishing computer games. But increasingly, small British startups are looking to apply their expertise more widely, hoping to transform millions of lives in the years ahead. In the third of our series on the digital tech revolution, Rita Chakrabarti takes a closer look at those emerging firms and the talent behind them.
Digital startups have been popping up all over the UK. London leads the way, but 3/4 of all tech businesses are in fact outside the capital. Edinburgh is a huge growth centre. At the university, they're designing imposing new robots to carry out tasks as diverse as housework and space exploration. At the opposite end, there's Marty, a pint-sized robot designed to get children interested.
They're very cute.
Thank you.
Not threatening. Big eyes. But what's the point of them?
There's a real shortage of engineers already in the UK, and as robotics becomes a bigger thing, as we need more and more of those skills, it's very important that we get people inspired when they're young to get into engineering.
In the shadow of old Edinburgh is the new. Codebase is an incubator for around 70 aspiring digital businesses and new startups. Some have now emerged as multi-million-pound companies, demonstrating the UK's strength in this sector.
What we're amazing at is building companies for industry. So rather than something which is very consumer-facing, it's building solutions for industry. So things like healthcare, things like energy, things like security, cloud computing, in fact every sector you can imagine, and building those solutions which have global impact.
Speech Graphics is a software company. We develop software that converts speech, audio, into facial animation.
This technology, using a real voice to drive a virtual face, is already used in the gaming industry. It's going to spread and transform our relationships with computers, according to one of this firm's founders.
Virtual humans will become more and more prevalent throughout our lives, and the way that we relate to our computers is going to be increasingly the way that we relate to each other.
Where will new ideas for the future come from? Well, it's hoped partly from here, a coding club for the under-19s, for aspiring digital entrepreneurs.
I found making software is a lot more fun than simply using it, so I've always been interested in programming.
I have a couple of ideas about maybe working in digital technology, except coding, I'm not entirely sure whether it could be a job but more of a hobby.
There is one big challenge, getting more women into the industry. But work being developed here looks set to stretch into every area of our lives.
So could this be the face of the future? Many in this city think so. Rita Chakrabarti, BBC News, Edinburgh.
And a quick reminder that Newsnight's on BBC 2, 11 o'clock in Scotland. Here on BBC 1, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.